Endowed Professor of History at Albion College in Michigan. Dr. Cantor is a Chicago native and teaches U.S. Latinx, Latin American, and immigration history at Albion. She earned a PhD in history from the University of Virginia, and her first book, titled Hijos del Pueblo, explored gender, family, and community in rural Mexico in the 18th and 19th centuries. We're delighted to have Dr. Cantor with us today to hear about her latest book, published by the University of Illinois Press last year, titled Chicago Católico, Making Catholic Parishes Mexican. Before turning it over to Professor Cantor, I'd like to note that after Professor Cantor's talk, the question and answer period will be led by Dr. Ruth Gomberg Munoz, Assistant Professor of Anthropology here at Loyola. Please ask your questions in the chat directly to Ruth. She is a sociocultural anthropologist who has spent much of her career conducting research and organizing in Chicago's Latinx immigrant communities. Thank you for being here and welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Brad. Folks can see me? Yes? Okay, so it's always weird when you get going. In April, when everything shut down, my book came out last January, I got to do one really big, beautiful book talk at the National Museum of Mexican Art. And then when everything shut down and people started doing online talks, I was like, no way, I am never doing an online talk. And I don't even know how to share my screen. It'd be so weird. And then there's a day like today where there are people on this call, friends and colleagues from San Antonio and from Minnesota and Philadelphia and the South Side of Chicago and Albion, Michigan, and Lansing. And I think my friend from the Bronx is here. I just think it's very cool that we can get together and do this. It's really nice to be back at Loyola. The last time I was here was in 2014 for the Chicago Catholic Immigrants Conference on the Mexicans. That was a really wonderful two-day event. And it gave me a lot of opportunity to get to know colleagues like Elaine Pena, Ray Salazar. I got to meet Maria Hinojosa at that event as well. If you're in Chicago, I hope it's a sunny day like it is in Michigan, and all the best, because in Chicago you can use your lakefront again today, right? So the mayor has opened it up. I want to thank a few people for making this talk possible today. From the history department at Loyola, I'd like to thank Ben Johnson, who has been following my work for quite some time, Gema Santa Maria, also Nathan Elstrand, and of course, Brad Hunt, the chair of the history department. I would also like to thank Michael Murphy and the staff at the Hank Center and Dr. Ruth Gomberg Munoz. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, 1 second. 1 second. It's like I can't open the top bar of things, but we'll get there. It's coming, but it's not. Okay, no. Damn, okay. All right. This is a little different than what I use at work. 1 second. No, that's not it. Oh, we would think I had never done this before. I'm gonna stop sharing screen for 1 second and open up my slides. slideshow from beginning. Thank you all for your patience here. Okay, back in. We're good. We're in. I'm fine. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about my book, which came out in 2020. And I want to tell you a little bit how I started. Once upon a time, I was a historian of colonial Mexico. And I spent my time in judicial archives and a little bit of church archives in the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, and read manuscript things on the 18th century, trying to unearth needles in haystacks about gender and indigenous communities in central Mexico. And that led to my first book, Hijos del Pueblo, Gender, Family, and Community in Rural Mexico. Now, while I was working on that project, particularly in the 90s, I would come home from Mexico and I would visit Chicago. And every time I visited Chicago, it seemed like yet another neighborhood had become a Mexican neighborhood, right? There were more and more places to speak Spanish. And it was very clear that Chicago was becoming like another section of Mexico. And I kind of wondered about how that was playing out, but I was a colonial Mexican, so I wasn't supposed to research it. In the fall of 2000, I was in residence at the Newberry Library, and one day I escaped from the library and I went down to the southwest side to the little village neighborhood, and I walked into St. Agnes of Bohemia Church. And the church, it was just after a Sunday Mass, and kids were running around, and the Virgin of Guadalupe was up on the altar, and everybody was speaking Spanish, and it felt like a very Mexican church to me. And then I looked up at the stained glass windows in this church, and what I found was that the stained glass windows had dedications on them in Czech language, like this one. And when I first saw them, I had no idea what they said. Like, I later had to get translations. But while I was at St. Agnes that day, I kind of wondered, I thought, this neighborhood wasn't always Mexican. This church obviously used to be a Czech church. And I began to wonder what that transition was. And I wondered what it was like to be the first Mexicana or Mexicano to walk into an all Euro-American parish and to attend Mass or say a prayer. And I decided I would spend 1 week in the archives seeing if there was anything about Mexican churches. And like 20 years later, I emerged with this book. Beyond the sort of normal expected archival research, along the way since the year 2000, I was very fortunate to do a lot of, it didn't feel like work. I was often invited to hang out with people who were my informants. The book draws upon about 40 or 50 oral histories that I conducted. And so I attended reunions from different kinds of organizations. On the left here, we have the St. Francis Cobras. And this was a Mexican-American girls volleyball and baseball team. And they would still get together for their Cobras reunions with people into their 80s. On the right, I attended an all-year Catholic school reunion at Providence of God. Providence of God was a historic Lithuanian parish in Pilsen, which became much more of a Mexican parish. And so along with me attending that night were the Sisters of St. Casimir, the largely Lithuanian order who were the teaching nuns at Providence of God. And I started going to kermesses, or street church fairs. And then there was the day where the Guadalupana seemed like really overworked, and I didn't have anything else to do. And I asked if I could help. And the next thing I knew, I had a Guadalupana apron, and I was out there dishing out enchiladas for like 8 hours and cleaning up at midnight. It was fun. Along the way, I learned that a parish is not just a church building, that a church is much more than mass. I learned that a parish is a living thing, that it is a community, that in the best of times, it is available to people 24/7. And that was definitely the case historically in lots of places in Chicago. So a brief overview about what I do in this book. My book tells the story of how Mexicans have made a home in Chicago and its churches. Today, Mexicans and other Latinos are transforming the Archdiocese into Chicago Católico in ways that past generations of German and Irish bishops, priests, and sisters never would have imagined. I use the Catholic parish to view Mexican immigration and transformation in the United States. For individuals arriving from Mexico, these parishes served as a refugio, a refuge. Mexicans fiercely attached themselves to specific parishes, much like European ethnic groups in days gone by. Their parishes in Chicago were a place to speak Spanish, they were a place to get job leads, and they were definitely a place to reminisce about Mexico. At the same time, these parishes had an Americanizing influence on Mexican members. Men and women took part in regular devotions and parish activities in ways quite similar to Polish, Italian, or Irish Catholics throughout Chicago. Their children participated in May crownings of the Virgin Mary, and they played baseball on parish sports teams. Many Mexican American lay people gained a sense of Mexicanidad by participating in religious and social events at these parishes. I argue that the parish acted as a glue that connected immigrant parents and their US reared children. Now, amazingly, well, it shouldn't be amazing to me, but it still amazes me. And especially if you are new to learning about Chicago's Mexican history, Mexican people have been in Chicago for over a century now. Which, like, I gave my first book talk in Buffalo, New York, and everybody was very taken aback by that. So let's take the story back to some of the first people who arrived from Mexico to Chicago. We're starting off here with a retablo, which is a painting done like a devotional painting to a saint or the Virgin Mary. So painted on tin, usually by the person who was in need of divine intervention and received it. So what we have here with this 1918 retablo, it's the story of a man, Matias Lara, and you can see him kneeling in the center. He's wearing his overalls, carrying a very big candle, and praying to or thanking the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, who is like the second most popular Virgin Mary in Mexico after the Virgin of Guadalupe. So Matias arrived in Chicago in late November in 1918. And this is the story he told on his retablo. Finding myself lost in Chicago, I entrusted myself to the Virgin of San Juan. Asking that she illuminate the road that I sought, I gave her thanks for having granted me what I asked, and I dedicate the present offering as a commemoration. Matias arrived in this big city. We can see the traffic, we can see the smog. He could not figure out how to get to the place he needed to go, but he had his internal faith, and he prayed to the Virgin Guadalupe. He probably ran into another Mexican migrant who just, told him where he was going. But this is how he remembered and commemorated the story. When Matias came in 1918, there were no churches that really had Spanish-speaking clergy. So the faith was internal. A few years later, things would begin to change. And soon there would be two churches that were established that offered services to people who were Spanish speaking. A little bit about one of these pioneras, Elidia Barroso, left Mexico as an orphaned teenager during the Mexican Revolution. She spent like the next 8 years in San Antonio. When her sister and brother-in-law established themselves in Rockdale, which is near Joliet, probably because I'm guessing the husband came as a track worker, Elidia also joined them in Illinois, and their whole family moved from Mexico to San Antonio to Illinois. And the first generation of the Barroso family was born in the United States, was born in Rockdale. Little Loretta Cabrera there enjoying her ice cream cone. Loretta was the beginning of 4 more generations of people descended from Elidia and her siblings in Chicago. Elidia was fortunate when she got married in 1924. Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in South Chicago had Spanish-speaking clergy, and so she could get married in a way that was like familiar for her. And by the time Loretta Cabrera was old enough for her first communion, she did that at St. Francis of Assisi Church. So the process of building a Mexican identity and community well beyond the Southwest began at just 2 Chicago parishes in the 1920s. The Spanish-speaking Claretian order ministered to Chicago's growing Mexican population. This missionary order had arrived in the US in 1902, and they tended to Spanish speakers initially in Texas and Arizona. When the Claretians heard that 3,000 Mexicans now lived in Chicago, they considered how to reach the Mexicanos up north. And they were able to establish this first from like brick and mortar church in South Chicago, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And like the next year, arrangements were made for them to take over an existing church, St. Francis of Assisi, which was an old German parish. And St. Francis of Assisi, which still stands today, it's on Roosevelt Road, about a block in from Halstead. And this is right on the edge of the UIC campus. Let's see, can we do hand raises? I don't think we really can, but I'll just ask anyhow. If we were in the room together, I always wonder how many people have actually been to St. Francis of Assisi. And depending where I'm giving the talk, it's usually a lot of people. This church became known as La Catedral. We got some hands, okay. So this church became known among Spanish speakers as La Catedral Mexicana, really serving Mexicans and their children almost exclusively from the 1920s through the 1940s. By the 1950s, Puerto Rican people are also attending parish events there. The church, somewhat miraculously, still serves Spanish-speaking people. And this photograph is from the 1940s. The stained glass windows have German captions because they're the original windows. But if you look carefully at the front altar to the right, you will see an altarpiece dedicated to La Virgen de Guadalupe, which was put up early in the 1920s and then like renovated, and a bigger one in the late 40s as the Mexican population there continued to grow. From the 1920s through the 1960s, St. Francis, the church, rectory, school, convent, and gym, and we've got the gym on the right here. St. Francis provided a lively, nurturing home for Mexican immigrants and Mexican American young people. The children may have grown up in poverty, but with a parish to call their own, they didn't feel marginalized. The Mexican church anchored the community, and its children grew up with a positive grounding in Mexican and US Catholic traditions. This experience would manifest itself as thousands of Mexican origin people entered new neighborhoods, including Pilsen in the 1960s. In the new neighborhoods and in new parishes dominated by Euro-Americans, many former St. Francis members would assume a vanguard position. And we'll see a couple examples of that. So in the middle of the 20th century, there is so much action going on at St. Francis of Assisi, really the true sort of cultural center of the near West Side Mexican community, which had about 40,000 Mexican people. And then in the early 1960s, it becomes the site of the University of Illinois at Chicago campus, and almost the entire Mexican neighborhood is bulldozed and destroyed, with only St. Francis of Assisi and a couple of its buildings left standing. One of the neighborhoods that a lot of near West Side Mexicans moved into was the Pilsen neighborhood. And for those of you not from Chicago, you've got the inset map there. Pilsen is about a mile and a half just to the southwest of the Loop. And it has good public transportation to the Loop and also to the train yards where many Mexican men were working. This map, which I had made for my book, shows you this relatively narrow strip of a neighborhood. It's about a mile and a half wide. And one of the things that's striking about it is that in a mile and a half, there were 13 churches built there between 1875 and 1915. Peak years for immigration from Europe, right? So 13 churches, and you can see them, and some of them are like within 2 blocks of each other. A little game I play with myself when I go to Pilsen, maybe standing on the L platform on 18th Street, is how many church steeples can I see from here? And you know, on a good day, you can usually see like 3 at the same time. That's how close together they are. So why were there so many churches built within one neighborhood? It speaks to the incredible diversity of European immigration. So on the eastern half of the slide, Providence of God was founded by Lithuanian Catholics. St. Procopius, and here I'm moving west, St. Procopius was founded by Czechs. St. Adalbert's was founded by Polish immigrants and their children. St. Anne's was another Polish parish. Heading down to the southwest, we've got St. Paul's, which was founded by German immigrants. And in addition, there's also Slovenian, Croatian, Slovak parishes. So this was the neighborhood that Mexicans moved into. And to give you a little taste of what the neighborhood was like when Mexicans started to rent apartments or actually buy their own homes. These are, sources that come from the 1950s. You've got the church societies at St. Procopius, the Czech Catholic Church, where, many of their church societies were still using Czech language. And then I just love Mr. and Mrs. John Bren of Holy Trinity Croatian. So in the 1950s, people moved from the near West Side. They came from Mexico and Texas. And I was wondering, where were the first churches that started to take in Mexican people? Who were the first Mexicanos to start coming in? And when I could, I went through stacks of parish bulletins, and sadly, they're not saved in very many places, but the Dominican archives actually had a good run of them. And this is from a parish bulletin from 1947. I went through week after week of these, and on the Friday 7 o'clock mass in 1947 was dedicated to San Juan de los Lagos, the same Virgin Mary that Matias Lara was devoted to decades before. So this to me is my first Mexicano, like moving into one of these Eastern European Catholic churches. People, as they moved into the neighborhood, found it was pretty easy to literally move in. The landlords would rent to them. The home sellers would sell to them. This was really quite different than was the case for other new arrivals to Chicago, African Americans who were coming up from Arkansas and Mississippi, who found that there were many neighborhoods where nobody would rent to them and nobody would sell to them. And I see something quite different happening with Mexican and Mexican American arrivals in these Euro-American neighborhoods. So what was going on? Why was it they were able to actually sort of create homes and take a neighborhood like Pilsen and make it their own? So we've got a choice comment here from a Catholic Charities report from the 1950s describing the Pilsen neighborhood. And Catholic Charities officials wrote, Mexicans are still viewed as invaders by the older residents, many of whom still retain their own ethnic outlook and language. However, the Mexican is considered a much lesser evil than the surrounding Negroes. By the mid-1950s, many priests in Pilsen grudgingly accepted Mexicans joining their parishes. And I think a lot of it was they were willing to accept Mexicans who were Catholic, and they were also pretty willing to accept Mexicans because they were not Black. Some of the first pioneers in these parishes were actually the school children. So here we are back at the Lithuanian Providence of God School, where I got to go to the all-year reunion like 5-6 years ago. It's Sister Helen's class, and most of these kids are probably the children of Lithuanian immigrants. Some of them might be Lithuanian displaced persons. And one of the things that's striking in the what's it called, bulletin board by the windows lists it names Lithuania, our dear homeland, which I believe is the Lithuanian national anthem, right? So it's a Catholic school, but it's a Lithuanian Catholic school. And then if you look at the front row of Sister Helen's classroom, look at that little boy wearing I think he's got a tie on. You know, there's one of our Mexican pioneros coming in and really integrating Providence of God. Another example from another school in the neighborhood, and anytime you can find school photos from the 50s and 60s, the pattern is pretty similar. St. Adalbert's Polish Catholic Church, 1960, on the bulletin board, Americans all, quite a crowded classroom, of course, because it's 1960. And most of these kids were Polish and Polish American, but there's a few people who, if you look carefully, you can tell that they are people of Latin American descent. By 1974 at St. Adalbert School, it was pretty much a different ball game. The majority of the children had Hispanic surnames: James Chavez, Porfirio Gomez, Leonard Ortega, et cetera, et cetera. Another space of integration beyond churches, so we've got schools as a place of integration and change, but another space was sometimes at businesses in the neighborhood. And people who have been to Pilsen definitely recognize the El Nopal Bakery sign. And a nopal is a prickly pear cactus. It's like a super Mexican icon. The El Nopal Bakery had first existed in the St. Francis neighborhood. Francisco Bonilla, who's holding the baby in the photograph, he moved from Mexico. He started as a baker in one of the big downtown hotels in Chicago, opened up his own Mexican bakery. When that neighborhood was depopulated with the construction of the campus, Francisco Bonilla is like, I need to move. Like nobody's going to come and buy bread and pan dulce at my bakery anymore. And so he followed his clientele to Pilsen. And the photograph was taken on the day of transfer of ownership. The Bonillas bought the bakery from Mr. Fritz. Sounds probably German-American. And one of the really amazing things about this photograph is there's somebody there in the middle. You notice the Catholic priest, and it's Father Ray Bianchi, one of the Claretian priests from St. Francis of Assisi. He came to sort of bless the Bonillas taking over of this bakery. I think it was called the Ace Bakery, and it became El Nopal. And I think now it's a dark matter coffee shop, but they're keeping the sign. By 1965, there were 3 churches in Pilsen that were celebrating Misa in Espanol. There's an interesting sort of timing issue here. Before the 1960s, all of the masses were, of course, in Latin, right? But people sang hymns in vernacular languages. They said the rosary in vernacular languages. But with Vatican II, this now opens up that Mass can be and should be in the vernacular. And this timing of people coming, Spanish-speaking people coming into Pilsen, I think it's like things dovetailing. We've got great ethnic changes in these parishes, as well as this Vatican II push for going to the vernacular, and that opens things up to Spanish. And throughout the neighborhood, the priests, especially the head pastors, they are hustling in the 1960s to come up with Spanish-speaking clergy, because none of them speak Spanish. So they're sending their young men downtown to Berlitz language school. They're sending them to Puerto Rico for the summer. They're sending them to Mexico for 6 months, telling them that they should learn all of the culture that they can. Most of the churches that really persisted into the 70s and 80s and 90s, these were churches where the pastor said, we need to have Spanish-speaking clerical staff, and they acted on it. Here's another little story, a little episode from St. Anne's. St. Anne's was an old Polish church, and Mexican families began moving in the mid-60s. And the installation of the Virgin of Guadalupe at St. Anne's marked a real turning point. A Mexican family at St. Anne's donated the image. It came from Mexico with papers and all. Lupe and Matias Almendares were selected to carry the image, and they joined the couple that donated it through the nearby streets. The 2 couples proudly carried the Virgin of Guadalupe on a 2-block procession led by a priest before entering the church sanctuary. For decades, the image remained prominently displayed by the main altar, parallel to Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Polish Virgin Mary. Taking part in the procession in the installation felt beautiful to the Almendares family. Soon after, Mexican parishioners purchased a Mexican flag to place by the Virgin's side. The installation of the Mexican Virgin marked a change to Mexicans and Poles alike. And as one St. Anne's parishioner recalled, the Polish people realized you weren't going anywhere. So this photograph, I wanted to be the cover of my book, and the press had other ideas. So I don't know, as a Chicagoan, there could really be nothing better than this with the original, the only Mayor Daley in my book. So it was December 12th, the day of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And I want to tell you a little bit about the woman, the adult woman in the left corner, Julia Rodriguez. I interviewed Julia in what was called an English basement apartment in Pilsen, which meant it was like slightly below ground. And she must have been about 80 when I went to interview her. And we got going with the permissions. I was getting ready to run the tape recorder. And she stopped me and she said, ¿Se puede hacer la entrevista en español? Can we please do the interview in Spanish? I was like, yeah, we can. So she had a beautiful Spanish. It was like a Spanish from like generations ago. Julia had been born in the Rio Grande Valley into like a Mexican exile family. She grew up picking cottons. Her family was poor. They had to move around. Some years it was picking cotton in Mississippi. Some years it was in Texas. She had just a bare bones education. When she got married in the mid 50s, her husband, Ruben, was already working in Chicago, and he brought her up to Chicago. And she didn't like Chicago at first. I asked her what she thought about going to church at St. Procopius, the Czech church, and her response to that was, "Los polacos como que no." The Poles? No way. And this phrase, "los polacos," it's a very common phrase for an older generation of Spanish speakers in Chicago to refer to like Slavic people. Czechs are polacos, Lithuanians are polacos, Poles are polacos too. Los polacos como que no. It was hard for her at first at St. Procopius, being one of the only Mexican parishioners. Decades later, she was picked by people in her parish to take this framed image of the Virgin of Guadalupe to go with her husband and with children from St. Procopius and to take it to the mayor's office in City Hall. So there's been a big shift in 2 decades in Julia's life. And considering Julia's impoverished childhood, this photo expressed an adulthood of stability, respectability, faith, and belonging. Julia stood proudly as a Mexican-American Catholic with the pinnacle of her adopted city, the mayor, himself a Catholic. With her husband, Ruben, and the parish children, she represented St. Procopius. 2 decades earlier, she hesitated to attend Mass there. Los polacos como que no. By 1976, St. Procopius was home. Chicago had usually been willing to give a chance to Mexicans, fellow Catholics, who, like the Irish, Czechs, Poles, and Lithuanians, also expressed their devotion to the Virgin Mary. Pilsen became Chicago's first Mexican majority neighborhood precisely in the 1970s. And during this time, the Mexican voices grew louder, both Mexican Catholic voices and Mexican secular voices, right? This is the time period of the sort of the heyday of the Chicano movement. And just months after Julia's visit to the mayor's office on Good Friday, the first Via Crucis, or Living Way of the Cross, took over 18th Street. These events differ greatly in tone and message, but both Julia's visit to the mayor's office and the Via Crucis both showed the rise of a Chicago Católico. For this event, 7 Pilsen parishes banded together, planning, rehearsing, making costumes, growing beards, renting a horse to make a Good Friday that no one would forget. The Via Crucis proclaimed Pilsen as a Mexican and Catholic space in a neighborhood dominated just 15 years earlier by Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. Unprecedented, the 1977 Via Crucis reflected lofty goals of engaging issues of social justice and embodied an identity at once Catholic, Mexican, and Chicano. Julia Rodriguez's portrait with the mayor and Pilsen's Via Crucis both expressed strong Mexican and Catholic identities in 1970s Chicago. These events were unthinkable back in the teens and the 20s when people like Matias Lara and Elidia Barroso and other Mexicans first arrived in the when they first arrived in Chicago. In the 1920s, No one ever would have imagined that Chicago would become the second largest Mexican metropolis in the United States. And every time I give this talk out on the East Coast, people are like, what? So come to Chicago, see. In the 1920s, no one could have imagined that the city would be dotted in parishes that serve Spanish-speaking people. And we have a little screenshot. I think it's like a find a mass page from the Archdiocese of Chicago. And you can, plug in different languages. Like, do you want to know where there's a mass, which is celebrated in Vietnamese or in Creole, etc.? Well, this is what happens if you type in Spanish. So those are the places only within the city of Chicago. We're not even going out to the suburbs here. So back in the day, in the 20s, there were 2 churches that served Spanish-speaking people. In 2015, Misa en Español was celebrated at 130 parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago. That was about 40% of parishes. The making of Mexican parishes helped generations of immigrants create new homes and identities. First at St. Francis of Assisi and Our Lady of Guadalupe, and in the past half century at parishes across Pilsen and obviously across the city and into the suburbs. I wrote a book about making parishes Mexican, but in these same years, we've seen a serious unmaking of parishes in the city. Those of you who have any connections to the Archdiocese of Chicago know that this process of consolidating parishes in Chicago is called Renew My Church. And it's been going on for quite some time. Pilsen had 13 parishes. At the time I started the research 20 years ago, there were 7 parishes in Pilsen. Today, 3 parishes are left standing. And a little scene from the year that St. Adalbert's Polish Mexican church was officially closed. And there's lawsuits in place to try and keep the building from becoming something secular, but it has become a desanctified site. But even in the middle of December, people will show up outside and create an altar to the Virgin of Guadalupe. That space of the church of St. Adalbert's, their family church, is so meaningful. I'm going to end with the dedication to my book, which I dedicated to the very generous people del pasado, del presente, of St. Francis of Assisi, St. Adalbert, St. Anne, St. Paul, St. Pius, St. Procopius, and Providence of God, and to the generations of Chicagoans to come from Mexico and around the world. It wouldn't be a book talk if I didn't make a little pitch. The book is available in paperback. It's very affordable. It's available at a number of independent bookstores in Chicago. On the north side, I think Women and Children First is selling it. Pilsen Community Book sells it. Other books will order it for you. You could order it also. There's that really famous online bookstore. It starts with an A. I don't really like to buy things from them. If you are interested in getting some Chicago Católico bookmarks, drop me a line. Or if you just want to share a family story or ask me a question, decanter@albion.edu. And if you forget that, you can find me online. Super easy. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Let's turn it over to Ruth Gumborg Munoz to lead us in question and answer.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Cantor, for that wonderful talk. Remember, everybody, to chat me your questions. I'm Ruth Gumborg Munoz, or yeah, there we go. So now we can see everybody. So of course, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try and make sure that we get to everybody. It looks that we have about 20-25 minutes. Is that about right? So let's get started.
I just have to jump in here. I'm just like really struck, but my new friend from Guanajuato is attending this. And we couldn't have done that a year ago. So, there's a few good things out of this pandemic. Hi, Connie. Sorry, Ruth.
No, no worries. Hi, Connie. Nice to see you. I have family in Guanajuato too. So, and I was telling Dr. Cantor as we were sort of chatting beforehand that my son was actually baptized at Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe on the south side. And I was reminiscing, reading her book about that experience. So while everybody sort of gathers their thoughts, I was thinking we could start with a question from the chat, if that's okay. Are you ready, Dr. Cantor? Or you need a couple minutes?
I'm good.
All right. So this is a question.
I spent 20 years trying to come up with answers.
All right, so this is a question that comes from Sergio Limas, and he says, Dr. Cantor, your work seems to suggest that the relations between Mexicans and white Americans was a little bit, like gentle in terms of racial prejudice, but highly racialized when African Americans attempted to engage with the Eastern European churches. But of course, as you observe, white Catholic churches accepted Mexicans because otherwise they wouldn't have survived. So in general, do you feel like your work diminishes those racial tensions sort of strategically to offer an integrationist narrative, or does the history there really indicate that there was, less harsh treatment toward Mexican arrivals by the church leadership?
Thank you, Sergio, for the question. And it can feel like a complicated issue. When I came into this project, a lot of what I knew about Chicago's history was a history of a Black-white binary, right? When I started getting into doing the research on Pilsen, I wondered if I was going to find a story of white flight. And I think it's just a blurrier question. And I think especially for adults who are interested in getting involved in these churches, if there was good and open-minded parish leadership, then the parishes kind of gradually took people in. And I did use the term at some point during my talk, like a kind of a grudging acceptance. There was often a very awkward decade. A decade is a pretty long time for your parish to not feel 100% welcoming. Some of the oral histories that I did from people remembering their first church fairs, where they're the first Mexican families, where like Mexican women were told to keep on their side of the kitchen, right? Or when it was time to count the cash at the end of the night, like Polish American men not wanting to let Mexican men take over that. There were tensions. Things definitely look different if you look at the history of Pilsen and you're thinking more about young people. I think, there's a lot of literature about like gang activity, and there was violence and there was intimidation from white American males dealing with Hispanic males. But most of the stories that came up and still come up with like social media groups from Pilsen, there's a Pilsen Memories group that I hang out with a lot. People who grew up in the parishes, they had friends who were of different ethnic groups, and they often remembered their older Slavic neighbors as like helping them out, and these younger Mexican families helped out the older Polish and Lithuanian neighbors. So, on one-on-one, there were often reasonable relationships, and not every parish really invited Mexican people in. There was a Slovenian parish, St. Stephen's, which is where Cristo Rey High School is today. St. Stephen's in the 1980s would not say Mass in Spanish. So they were like, we already do it in Slovenian and English. Why would we in Spanish? Their neighborhood was probably 75% Mexican and Mexican American. They just were not really willing to fully open the doors. So, yeah. And another way that I think about this question of like Mexican sort of like softer entry as opposed to African Americans, I think a lot about what happened with ethnic succession and the Catholic Church in Detroit. I live an hour from Detroit, and Detroit, is like 90% African American. You should see their list of closed parishes, right? with so many people coming who were not Catholic, right? Most African Americans being Protestant. It's just, neighborhood after neighborhood, parish after parish in Detroit was not able to survive with this heavily Black and non-Catholic population. Okay, that was really long-winded.
All right, we've got two questions that are a little bit similar in their orientation, so I'm going to try and combine them if that's okay. So the first one is from Anne Marie Cunningham, and it says, since in many cases Mexicans didn't build these parishes originally, what happens to the children and grandchildren, right, of the Eastern European immigrants who remain in the neighborhood? And then the second question is from Patrick Hyland, and it says, it strikes me that this project of making Catholic parishes Mexican highlights the changing demographics of Chicago neighborhoods over the years. And so does your research provide any insight on how Black Catholics have also influenced neighborhoods over the years? So what about all these other groups?
Okay, so some of the European ethnic groups where, the home parish, the mother parish was in Pilsen, but they moved out to inner ring suburbs or newer like subdivisions within the city of Chicago, often moving west and southwest out towards Midway Airport. You get the Croatians. They come back to Pilsen for Sundays for the one Croatian mass, and they come back to Pilsen for the celebration of the Croatian Virgin of Bristica, but they don't live in the neighborhood. When they took the Our Lady of Bristica around the neighborhood in a procession, there were more Mexican parishioners who were in that procession than Croatians. And then in time, the Archdiocese shuts it down. There's no more Croatian Mass at this Pilsen church. I feel like when I first started doing this research in like the year 2000, I definitely was seeing more of, older folks coming back or their children coming back for like a feast day. And that really, it fades. And it's getting played out in other neighborhoods. So if you want to see like what happened to Czech Catholics, they went to Berwyn and they went to Cicero, inner ring suburbs. And what I have found, because I thought maybe I could sort of follow the story out there, they're already out in suburbs that are like in other counties. So Czech life has left those places as well. That's what Chicago people do. They just keep moving. And in terms of African-American Catholics, the neighborhoods that I worked on, they're not involved in these churches. I wrote a little bit about what happened at St. Francis of Assisi on the near west side. That neighborhood was never majority Mexican, but that neighborhood was probably 25, 30% African-American, and Black Catholics did not attend church there. They were encouraged to go elsewhere. If Black Catholics wanted to send their kids to catechism with the sisters at St. Francis, the sisters at St. Francis sent them to St. Joseph's Colored Mission was the name of it, which was attached to Holy Family. There are some really good books about Black Catholics in Chicago too that I would recommend are Tim Neary's book, which of course I'm forgetting the name of, and Matthew Kressler also has written a really good history about Black Catholics in Chicago. It's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse.
All right, we've got another great question here. This one is from Rene Luis Alvarez, and it says, your book is about, or your talk at least was about how immigrants made parishes Mexican, but do you see any processes where engaging in parishes makes Mexican immigrants more American, right? That is, are there assimilation processes in play as Mexicans increasingly make claims on institutions to fulfill their needs, religious and secular?
That was like definitely going on. Often the generation born in Chicago, they may grow up with Spanish in the house. I mean, we could talk about the same stuff today. In the 1940s, they grew up with Spanish at home. And then the minute they walked out of the door with their brothers and sisters or the kids down the block, they're all speaking in English, right? Little Loretta Cabrera with her ice cream cone in 1926. She was so tied to St. Francis of Assisi, this Mexican church. I was super shocked to find out that as a teenager and a young person, she would always pick the mass that was for people who spoke English. So she didn't want to go to the Spanish mass. That was like, she kind of picked up Spanish more as an adult when she married her husband from Mexico, right? And she had no interest in soccer at the church, and there was no soccer at St. Francis of Assisi. They played baseball, they had boxing, they had basketball, right? American sports. And so at a place like St. Francis of Assisi, they just did a remarkable job of running a parish that met the needs of Mexican immigrant adults and Mexican American Chicagoans, right? And, they'd have events with different kinds of music. They'd show different kinds of movies, but there were enough facilities at the parish. They had a very big pastoral staff in the middle of the 20th century. Sometimes 6 priests working there, along with lay people who were employees and of course volunteers. And they were really able to make it a parish that worked for a lot of different kinds of people. And one of the markers I think with these churches is like what language is they celebrate Mass in. So at the churches, St. Francis of Assisi, every Mass there, and I think it's 7 every Sunday, every single Mass is in Spanish. That is that's a very much of like an immigrant's show. And these days it's not just from Mexico. There's this big clump of Ecuadorians who hang out there. And there's of course Hondurans and Guatemalans, and it looks like Latinx Chicago, right? The Pilsen parishes, it's a mix. They might, on a Sunday do 2 Masses in Spanish and 2 in English, which I think gives you a little sense of how things are changing.
I'm going to take advantage of my control over the mic to ask a question that I want to ask. Of course, the Catholic Church, along with other churches, but my understanding is that Catholic Church has been especially active in elements of immigrant rights organizing and offering sanctuary. There's the Interfaith Coalition for Detained Immigrants. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between the engagement with Mexican parishioners in these positions, right, on immigration that the Catholic Church has been, at least in Chicago, right, been very active in engaging.
So in the places that I did my work on, there have been moments where parishioners and clergy are very active and take a very clear stand, officially sanctuary, or just speaking up to, back in the day, INS officials. There was a Spanish priest at St. Francis, Father Peter Rodriguez, who was incredibly outspoken, go to marches, would get jailed, this and that, on behalf of undocumented immigrants and speak out against INS enforcement back in the day. Some of that same role got carried out at St. Pius. That would probably be, of the churches that survive today, that would definitely be sort of the most outspoken that way. St. Pius also does a lot of social outreach, social ministry, very active, like food bank, clothing bank, and this and that for people who are, port of first entry, newly arrived, no social safety net. St. Pius really plays that role in the neighborhood. St. Procopius a little bit. It's still a super important thing. And one thing I would say, this gets beyond, like immigrant rights, but boy, this last year, I don't even know what do I have to say about this. I've been sitting in my house in Ann Arbor for 11 months, but I watched a lot of masses and processions online. And I think for many newly arrived immigrants, not having all the months where the churches were literally closed, open at 25% capacity, when it was time for the Via Crucis in 2020, They were not allowed to hold the Via Crucis outside, but they went ahead and kind of did it anyhow. There was a lot of like putting the Blessed Sacrament on the back of pickup trucks and putting loudspeakers and going up and down the streets in the neighborhood. I think that for many immigrants who do not have like a wider social network, they don't have like multiple generations, they don't have the grandparents and this and that, people just like missed the social and of course devotional like meaning of church and parish. I think it was an incredibly painful year, and it's not done.
Well, we can't end on that note. I think we have time for one or two more questions. I've got one here from Ed Shea, and it reads, can you talk about the tensions that sometimes exist today generationally between sort of the old time Mexican immigrant generation and the younger Mexican American, US born children? Oh no, I'm sorry, I misread his question. Between the old time Mexican Americans and newly arriving immigrants. I apologize.
It was an eye-opener for me doing these oral histories, talking with people who grew up in Spanish-speaking homes in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and to hear them complain about the newcomers, right? The people who came usually straight from Mexico, like from the Rancho to 18th Street in 1975. They don't even speak English and they don't know what to do with their trash. They play their music so loud. I definitely heard these remarks a lot from people raised in the United States with Mexican immigrant parents. They reached out to people and they made bridges, but they definitely, it was just so striking to me that the Mexican American identity in Chicago, like how distinct it was. Everybody's connected to immigration, but they grew up in Chicago. They also grew up in a Chicago where not everything was in Spanish, like today, right? Like how many, there's cable television and this and that. That generation, that older generation, like born in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, something that was very different about them as opposed to, I think, people who grew up in Chicago today. Those were not particularly transnational times. If you grew up in Chicago in the 1930s and the Great Depression, you didn't go on vacation at Christmas to go see your family in Guanajuato, right? A lot of these Mexican Americans, they finally went to visit Mexico to meet their relatives during the 40s or the 50s, when they finally had some money, when air travel becomes more common. They didn't know Mexico very much. That strikes me as very different than today, where pretty much, as long as a person is a documented person, right? That travel, that back and forth with Mexico is so common, right? And so many of my students at Albion College, they go back for their parents' fiestas patronales. They go back to Jalisco and Michoacan. They go for their parents because their parents are undocumented and have not been able to see their communities for 25 years, right? But the 18-year-olds, the 20-year-olds are the ones who go as emissaries for the parents. This was not a thing for that sort of Chicago's first generation of Mexican Americans, who they definitely called themselves Mexicans. They called themselves Mexicans, they called themselves Americans, and they called themselves Catholics. And I think in the end, they were really Chicagoans. So that's a big difference.
That's a much nicer place to end. But I know that we're running out of time, and before we let you go, I just want to read another comment. This is also from Sergio Limas, and he says, please just remember to mention that Dr. Cantor's work is path-breaking, important, and offers what the new generation of Mexican youth need to know about their own history. Chicago Católico is American history, and I think we all would agree with that.
That's a wonderful comment. Thank you, Sergio. So, and one of the great joys in my career teaching Latin American history at Albion College about 10 years ago, I offered my first Mexican American history class. And I've taught it now 4 or 5 times. And every time I teach it, I'm like, it's US history. How am I teaching US history, right? And the students all, whether they are Latino or whether they're American, it's like, oh, like we never saw World War II through this lens, and it's a wonderful thing. So
I want to thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Ruth, for these wonderful stories, for this really important history, and for writing this book. And for being with us today at Loyola. We're grateful, and thanks to the audience, and join us for future programming. Thank you.
thank you, everybody. Que les vayan bien.